I see.
So I'm going to just turn it over to my pal Steve Cullis in just 1 second for our second panel. This panel was supposed to include, it was planned to include Professor Patricia Barkaskis from the Faculty of Law at UBC, but she was unable to do it because of a scheduling conflict. So you got 3 dudes up here. So they will have their say and we'll get into a discussion as soon as we can. Before we move on then, I would just like to say a very warm and heartfelt thank you to Kate Higgins of Unit Pitt Project for hosting a good chunk of the free school down the street. Jamie Ward has done fantastic playlists for us. And last but not least, Brady Crankle, who is hosting us tonight. He's the proprietor of Selector Records here. So thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure working with you guys. And we look forward to working more in the future together. So I'm just going to turn it over to Steve Cullis.
That's great. Thank you, sir. We may be 3 dudes, but we're all idiots, so it'll be all right.
In all senses.
All senses, yeah, exactly, all senses. So I'm going to say just a couple of words to get us going, kind of like Samir was doing, kicking off the discussion, but also we're missing a person, so I don't think I have very long, really, though. But just to set out some territory that we can talk around, and I think the 2 things keep coming back to my mind that I was already thinking about before we got going, and that were coming up earlier. And one is that kind of material structure base side, if you will. You know, what's going on in the world right now when we look at things that we refer to as austerity and that model, Samir, you're referring to, where what Europe used to do to other nations, doing to its own population. You know, structural readjustment and that sort of thing. Then on the other side, this cultural wing where things like the use of social media, the production and dissemination and policing of identities is also part of the picture we're looking at. So what I'm going to do is just I'm going to talk continuity, I think, more than discontinuity in some ways, although I agree that there's as much continuity as there is continuity, but I'm going to say a few things I think more to do with continuity in throwing out another, and I think kind of obvious definition of fascism, or at least fascistic processes. So I think of fascism as a means of tapping into, organizing, redirecting, systematizing, and weaponizing an always present, wider, and more general phenomenon arising from oppression, marginalization, disquiet, and dissent, socioeconomic regression, depression, austerity, etc., by galvanizing such general distemper around a socially identified marginal scapegoat group. This is kind of an obvious basic definition of what fascism does. Canalizes and directs things. You know, you're all upset, maybe you've been listening to some socialists. We've got a way simpler message here. It's these assholes, and we'll show you what to do. And it's kind of why, so there's this simmering thing that fascism taps into. I think it's where your AI, Hilda, comes in too, is what does the AI do? It listens to what it's hearing out there, the noisiest voices and maybe the most common things going by in social media, and starts repeating these things. It starts organizing this information that is something becomes all about hatred. That's you know, and again, I think you parallel argument with, you know, Donald Trump as the president of the United States deserved right now, maybe, because it's showing exactly what's really there under the surface. Well, here's how ugly that really looks like. Okay, I think becoming fascistic, that is, becoming socially weaponized around manufactured threats and hatreds, is always a social potentiality, sadly. It's kind of a pessimistic view, I think, maybe, that gets tapped into and brought to the surface at various historical moments. So there was a certain tapping into a discontent and disquiet that we see as, well, thank you, historical fascism, you know, 19-teens through 1930s, maybe. Is there a similar discontent that's waiting for some asshole to tap into it? Okay, where was I? Thus, I would suggest that what we are witnessing today is not yet a full-blown fascism, not totally comparable to what we've seen in the past, but a rising of the process of becoming fascistic to a level where we have begun to recognize it as such. I think of the word apocalypse, which means, of course, revelation, the becoming visible of something. I think that's where we are, the apocalypse of fascism. It could still go one way or another. Now, one thing I find disturbing about this new becoming of fascism is it's wrapping itself in, on the one hand, a cloak of normalcy. You know, we're just dudes who are down with that kind of thing. And on the other hand, taking ground, this goes back to something of Samir's comment just a few minutes ago, taking the ground that was once occupied by the left, where would-be fascists now see themselves as a dissenting minority with attendant rights and freedoms, such as freedom of speech. So it's just white supremacist as another identity, deserving of the rights and protection of any other identity. So I wouldn't totally agree that the right and left have switched places. I would see it more in terms of the right taking some ground that the left used to occupy, taking over certain discourses and ways of talking, and framing itself that the left we would more associate with. Yeah, so both these come up in this New York Times article that got a lot of attention from last weekend, right? Did people see this one? In America's heartland, the Nazi sympathizer next door. And so here's an example of normalizing the fascist. It could be just the guy you see in the grocery store. He's not so bad. And at the same time, that you see the normalizing coming together with this occupying of a kind of identity position we would normally think of someone on the left speaking this way. So this is what one moment in this interview or article about this guy, and he brings up, he's talking about what he calls fascism and what he associates himself with. And he takes an analogy from popular culture, a sci-fi film from 2013 called Pacific Rim. Does anyone know this film? In which society is attacked by massive monsters that emerge from beneath the Pacific Ocean. So this guy says, so the people, they don't ask the monster to stop, he says. They build a gigantic robot to try to stop them. And that's essentially what fascism is. It's like our version of centrally coming together to try to stop another already centralized force. So the poor, heroic fascists have been marginalized by some horrible centralizing monster. But they're not just going to say, hey, monster, please stop. They're going to build a robot. And they're going to fight freedom for the fascists. That's probably what disturbs me the most about what we're seeing now. And it is obviously very different than what you might have seen in the 19... Well, actually, I take that back. I don't know how much of that is for the 1930s, but that's another question. So I just thought I'd throw those ideas and thoughts into the air, and if anyone wants to look at this atrocious article, they could have a look at it maybe. But I'll turn it over, and Ajay, Harjap, we haven't decided who would like to go first. Ajay, do you want to go ahead? Yeah. Is that okay? Great. Let's turn this in a certain direction.
Okay, I'm responding to what Samir had observed about relationship with bourgeois democracy and its culture and regime of rights. And when we try and negotiate with this critical question in context of India, it becomes extremely, extremely difficult. Difficult because the social forces that may like to disrupt the homogenizing march of Hindutva may not necessarily be equally interested in critiquing an alternative and finding an alternative to capitalism and globalization. On the other hand, people who have a critique of political economy, their vision doesn't have space for accommodating the needs of oppressed nationalities and communities suffering under Brahmanism. So this becomes a very, very, very difficult thing, and that's why the effort, multiple efforts at the level of university campuses among students, which we have seen, I think practically one of the most important protests have happened only in university campuses in the last 2 years in India. attempts at building this alliance has not succeeded. Because the evolution is very different. The historical evolution of these social forces, their consciousness and their issues are very, very different. But there was an important point which a very well-known, renowned human rights activist, K. Balagopal, had mentioned many years back when talking about the issues of rights. And he was writing on the legal subversion of democracy. And that he says, the rights have got formal recognition in the law only because they have real recognition in the hearts of masses. And therefore, to rule the masses without recognizing the rights would be impossible. And equally, when it becomes necessary to violate the rights, it is preferable to enact the violation as formal laws, so that the legitimacy that attaches to law as such will give whatever justification that is possible for the violation. This is what we see is happening rampantly in India. There are laws which are illegal. And what do you do about it? So you are legalizing the illegality through legalization. And it becomes a very complex process that the system, the constitution, the parliament, the Supreme Court has been twisted, turned around, and thrown away in a sense that doesn't matter. You can do what you want, and you still gain legitimacy out of these acts.
I hear you.
So, Turkey.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. What I'm going to essentially now talk about is something I've grown up learning from my leftist friends and my own practice. What is the basic thesis of left? How does it try and understand the post-colonial India in very simplistic terms? Because I think it's important to have a hang of this. It's very important because this is a critique which is foregrounded in dealing with the situation, which tries to accommodate other points of views which the political economy cannot explain, but which also lacks a lot. And this particular piece is largely derived from Rajni Desai's work on aspects of Indian economy. Rajni Desai leads a very important independent Marxist economic group based in Mumbai called Research Unit in Political Economy. And these people they've been working for a long time on the political economy of India and non-funded. So Rajni Desai says that the failure of Indian state to carry out democratic reordering of society through genuine land reforms has given rise to a course of economic development and patterns of employment that have become more and more distorted and deformed, with vast numbers crowded into the informal sector struggling for a bare subsistence, while a tiny elite corners the bulk of the income. This, in turn, strengthens all regressive features of social life. Indian society, is perhaps the world's most fragmented, its toiling people divided by caste, religion, and there are many hierarchies and oppressions woven into social relations. So this is at the core of it. The second thing is this failure to carry out agrarian reform also leads to poverty of masses. And this in turn means there is a paucity of demand in the economy. This is shifting from culture to political economy. Since the 1980s, the rulers have tried to overcome this demand constraint by creating financial bubbles, expanding foreign debt, bank debt to industry, and I think it's phenomenal. The non-performing assets of Indian nationalized banks are phenomenal. Perhaps nowhere else in the world would national banks have as huge non-performing assets as in India. And share market maneuverings. However, when these bubbles burst, as they must, the underlying demand constraint resurfaces and the corporate sector finds itself in recession. We are in the middle of one such recession. Such recessions slow down the process of wealth accumulation drive of foreign investors and the Indian big bourgeoisie. They find this situation intolerable and call for extraordinary measures to revive that drive. And so the corporate sector demands that the state boost investors' urge to invest for profit by handing over to them huge wealth, either in the form of subsidies or public sector assets, through disinvestment or natural resources. In India, all three are happening simultaneously. But increasingly, this regime of dispossession has faced resistance, sporadic, localized, but resolute. Thus, the Congress regime, which was a regime of a political party before the present regime of Bharatiya Janata Party. Thus, the Congress regime, in spite of initiating military operation Green Hunt and vigilante group like Salva Judum in resource-rich Chhattisgarh, supporting Vedanta in Niyamgiri in Odisha, and POSCO in coastal Odisha, was not able to meet the expectations of the corporate sector. I think this is where the crux lies, why this shift happens. There's a very interesting word that the Indian bourgeoisie coined when their interests were not being met by the Congress government. They found it is incapable of meeting their interests. And the word and the term they use is policy paralysis. Policy paralysis was the term used by Indian bourgeoisie to describe Congress government led by Dr. Manmohan Singh. The bourgeoisie simultaneously countered it with a catchphrase of development. And particularly its Gujarat model. It's a state which Narendra Modi ruled for more than 20 years. Led by Narendra Modi of BJP through massive media blitz. Also, media blitz is possible because of the huge monopoly ownership of television channels by 2 or 3 corporate groups in India. So it's very easy. So the policy paralysis, development and Gujarat model meant essentially the same thing. Snatching the resources of people by brute force and handing them over to the corporations. In this regard, the BJP scored over Congress as BJP's delivery mechanism constituted a rabid communal and Brahminical mobilizing ideology of hatred, Hindutva. This is what wasn't as deeply embedded in the earlier regime. Though they are falling on the same trajectory, they are no different, but this is radically far ahead of its opponents. A huge network of foot soldiers all over the country at its command, which is Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS, and the leadership of Modi, who handed over vast resources of the people to the corporations in utter disregard of rules and regulations, laws and constitutional provisions. So this is his qualities. Modi is also a criminal who presided over the genocide of the Muslims and the endless murder of innocent Muslims in fake encounters by his Gujarat state machinery. Actually, the fake encounters of Muslims started much earlier, and Congress was the one who started it, but Modi carried it forward. The economic fragmentation, atomization of working people we have described above, and the people's consequent sense of alienation and insecurity supply fertile soil for the ruling classes to nurture sectarian identities and reactionary solidarities. The most powerful evidence of the strength of this ideological influence is not in the communal pogroms, horrible as they are. Rather, it is in the way communal fascist ideas are more and more made commonplace, treated as common sense, woven into the fabric of social life and identified with the nation. This is a potent means by which to mobilize support for all sorts of reactionary and anti-democratic measures. For example, suppression of free speech, right to organize, intellectual and religious freedoms. On the one hand, all these fragments are being influenced by the corporate mass media, which have grown exponentially in the last 25 years of neoliberal globalization. These media actually reinforce that fragmentation by promoting consumerism, individualism, sexism, national chauvinism, and even outright sectarian hatreds. Such media have had a particularly powerful effect among the vocal intermediate sections, but their penetration has gone even further to sections of the masses. This penetration has made the task of countering the ruling class manipulation and propaganda even more challenging. Connected with the earlier thing that I said, that because of historical reasons or difference in evolution of social forces, the alliance itself is a very difficult task to come up with in the first place. At the same time, the interlinked process of the spread of mobile telephony, digitization, and centralized identification in India, it's called Aadhaar card, are providing the ruling classes means of wider and wider access, supervision, and control over people. So this, in nutshell, is the situation right now. And because the forces which are supposed to be contending this are so fragmented for historical reasons, they're so fragmented that there's no common points, there's no alternative vision which encompasses the positions of everyone who are opposed to the system, that actually speaking, even if we presume that there's a change in the government through ballot, and this particular government is defeated in 2019 elections, the process that has been set in motion is not going to halt. It will go on. Thank you.
charge of. Yeah, get in there.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to all the presenters, Institute for hosting. This has been a great series, I think. Really appreciate the work that you guys have done. Also, just wanted to emphasize partly what Samir brought up, but to jump off the presentation that Ajay just gave. I think it is critical for us to look at fascism around the world, and I know that there's others in the audience that have spoken to it as well, just because I think we're always taught to kind of like look at the uniqueness of things, and we were talking about that a little bit in the earlier panel, but that also there are clear patterns, right? Like we can't ignore the obvious and clear patterns that are existing in all of these cases, and I would really encourage folks to learn more about the rise of Hindu fascism in India, and also some of the tactics and tools that they've been using over the years to establish their power in the region. And it's not just isolated to India anymore. Like the subcontinent is actually being impacted, like Nepal, other areas as well. I wanted to, for anyone that actually attended my earlier talk, I'm going to apologize a little bit because I'm going to be repeating some of what I did the first time, just because I thought it largely referenced some of the questions that were brought forward today. And I wanted to start off with just this kind of like notion of how we define fascism, right? And like what I started off with when we were speaking was this idea that very simplistic notion of like sort of corporate and state power coming together, like that sort of like idea of fascism. Wanted to start off by saying that that's colonialism, right? Like that's actually what it is. That's what established colonial states. That's what was the goal of colonial states, was to establish corporate power and their right to property, the establishment of property for corporations and their ability to then exploit them. And the rules were set up by the state so that they could fully take advantage of that process. British East India Company was a great example of that. But I would also say, the term post-colonial gets used a lot. I would also want to just name the fact that I would say India is not post-colonial, right? And I think that's an important thing to say and name, because the colonial state, if we recognize it as an occupation of land by a colonial structure, a colonial political entity, still exists. It was never taken away. The people in charge have changed, but the actual colonial institutions, I mean, the Land Acquisition Act that they're using in Nandigram and other places, the central government is using, is the colonial law, right? And we also need to recognize that nationhood has been occupied, whether with all of the independent struggles, whether it's like, Nandigram, I'm sorry, not Nandigram, but Nagaland and the Tamil struggle and Kashmir, like all of these areas of the subcontinent, there's an occupation there, right, by a colonial state, not dissimilar to the occupation that we talk about here when we talk about indigenous lands being occupied here, and that a colonial state was taking over varying national identities, right? And I want to raise that partly because I'm going to come back to it in terms of like there is an important point at which we're at today to really critique and challenge our narratives around the nation state and nationalism in the context of the nation state, which the left still is fairly reluctant to do. So recognizing that that simplistic definition of fascism is perhaps not adequate. One of the ways that I was trying to imagine it, trying to come up with this presentation earlier, and the way the kind of thing I settled on was a way of understanding fascism, that it's really about the freedom for the powerful to exercise their power on their terms and for their benefit without any obstacles, right? And I use the word freedom intentionally there, and you'll see why, right? And I think that's an important thing to recognize, the freedom for the powerful to exercise their power. And that's the socially powerful, the economically powerful, the politically powerful. It's who can exercise their power without any controls. And in the presentation, I'm not going to dwell on it as much today, but there was this notion that the right has been using of the nanny state. I don't know if people have heard this, a very feminized idea of the things that I think social movements and people had won within the state structure to sort of curtail the powerful, are being described now as the slap on the wrist nanny regulations on their ability to fully exercise their power, right? obviously the gender notion of that should be understood, right? In the sense of like Trump's actions in terms of like, not just Trump's, like Modi's opinions about gendered violence and other things are very related here, right? But the idea is that idea of care and protecting ourselves needs to be removed for the powerful to have complete freedom, right? And that complete freedom is something that we need to recognize as like a goal of the sort of the fascist movement here. And this kind of discussion about free speech, one of the things I want to kind of just put out there, Harper's removal of some of the hate speech regulations can kind of be seen as a counter to this nanny state, because who celebrated that removal of hate speech was largely some of the far right groups in Canada, right? So if they felt curtailed by some regulation within the state, there's a bit of a celebration to have that removed from the context of the Canadian system, so that the far right can fully exercise their ability for their speech, right? And I want to kind of place this like I did before, and I want to kind of place this discussion about free speech in the context of the free market, because I think we understand the free market very easily, right? The free market, we understand that the power of economic power really allows for corporate hegemony over land and resources and the operations of everything in our society, whether it's media and otherwise, right? But we also need to recognize that in the context of free speech, in a commodified society, resources mean a greater deal of power, right? So this notion of like that there's actual freedom of speech, that means equity of speech, and that everybody can just have a debate and have the ability to sort of challenge each other and equally be able to change a discourse, doesn't actually exist, right? We've seen that in the context of the platform that Trump was given. We've seen that in the context of what was just mentioned in terms of the corporate media in South Asia, which essentially allowed for the massacre of Muslim communities in Gujarat from the economic and political power that they were able to yield in terms of communicating what they wanted to communicate in order to encourage the masses to commit what they did, right? So there isn't this actual like sort of notion of freedom without understanding the powers within it, right? And I think one of the things that I want to kind of like name as like the issue there is that it is this challenge that we have to put forward to liberalism. Liberalism has this notion of erasing power within identities in all forms, right? There's this notion of equity without understanding, income inequality and people's access to things, racial biases, gender inequality, like all of the things that we deal with in society, we don't recognize as being something that, all of these this ability to not engage fully by liberals is not seen as something that's systemic, but they just want to have legal equality, and we'll worry about those things and people can kind of deal with them, right? So one also thing, like just recognizing the use of freedom by the US military, right? Protecting our freedom abroad. Fully exercising their power abroad, right? Like that's what they want, right? Is the ability to fully exercise their power. And sort of in talking about liberalism, and I know that we've talked, I know people in this audience will be very familiar with sort of like the debates around the politics of identity, and I largely try to use the term kind of liberal identity politics now, because I don't believe that there is any issue with organizing around identity. I think it's an important point of organizing, whether it's anti-racist organizing, whether it's feminist organizing, and other things. But there is this notion of liberal identity politics, which what it does is that it homogenizes groups, right? So what you're doing is that you're basically saying that like Hillary Clinton can be a feminist, without recognition of like her economic status, her race, and like her access to political power, right? But she's a feminist. So that all women should be supporting Hillary Clinton, even though you might not have anything in terms of shared interest with Hillary Clinton. So we all know this, I'm not going to dwell on it. But the idea of homogenizing, we need to start recognizing is that this form of identity politics actually enables and kind of sets the groundwork for fascistic development, right? Because white supremacy is an identity politics, right? And like I think folks have talked about that, right? Like it's a liberal identity politics where people that are white are supposed to be associating themselves with Donald Trump based on this construction of whiteness as being victimized within the American context right now, regardless of their economic status and like everything else that might exist, women otherwise, that would not relate to him, right? So this homogenizing issue also happens in communities of color, like, you know, representatives of communities of color that aren't working class, and the class context of, you know, women and communities of colors is oftentimes removed to equate us as all equal and all having the shared interest, right? And that's been one of the detriments of the left, right? And is that the left has lost its kind of grasp on how we talk about these politics. Mm-hmm. There's also a victimhood here, right? So like there's the white supremacy, just to name, right? So in fighting for their freedoms, they construct themselves as the victims. And I want to just go back to the analogy of the free market and free speech again. So we've seen the far right talking about them being shut down on campus, and that's a violation of our free speech. We should have free access because they want to exercise their power. I don't know how many people are familiar with like trade agreements, these like investor agreements that are happening around the world. But the ISDS clause, which is an investor-state arbitration mechanism within these trade agreements, is essentially corporations saying the same thing.
Wow.
We're being victimized, right? We want to come in and do our business. We're being victimized, and so you need to protect us. You need to allow us complete freedom to exercise our economic power within these jurisdictions and not be stopping us, right? And again, that's why I want to kind of equate this notion of free speech and freedom of the market as an analysis of power that we need to recognize. Also, just want to name labor movement. You know, just recognizing labor movement which used to historically talk about class, sometimes kind of talks about class now, but historically that often has been a critique of identity politics. In itself is an identity politics as well. You know, labor leaders going to Ottawa, talking to delegations, meeting with coalitions, saying that they represent labor, but I guarantee you none of them represent the, you know, women of color working on Annacis Island for $10 an hour, right? They definitely don't. So that in itself is also a form of identity that I think we need to challenge and break down. And so this brings me back to the critique of nationalism that we want to do, which is in itself also similarly a politics of identity that erases the differences and the conflicting interests within a society, right? The notion of nationalism and white nationalism being that you're being told that your interests are tied to the interest of the bourgeois and elite classes of your country, right? And the left has done, I think, a very poor job. So, and I'm going to say just in the terms of the nationalism, because I think this was in one of the questions, I want to say that there is a difference between nationalism overall, right? So the kind of, you know, I mean, I work for, I'm not going to go into it, but like I've been around movements in the 1990s and earlier when, you know, these free trade issues were happening where there was a nationalism that was a little bit a sort of a critique of neoliberalism in terms of like trade policy and other things that I don't think quite falls into the same kind of nationalism that we're seeing developing now, because it isn't the nationalism of the far right, and the nationalism of the far right does more clearly construct an enemy and an outsider and someone to target, as opposed to the nationalism of the left. But we also need to recognize that the nationalism of the left still erases those differences within that identity, right? And I think it needs to be challenged in the same sense that if in 2008 the financial crisis like allowed us the space to actually more openly and more aggressively critique nationalism, Trump's election in 2016 should be a way for us to more openly and provide a space to more aggressively critique the nation state and nationalism, and how that is being used to perpetuate some of these policies, like some of what we're seeing develop in terms of fascism right now. Last couple of things. I'm not going to go into the social media piece a lot just because of time, but I just want to say really quickly that I do find it interesting in terms of like fascistic tactics of the state, that this kind of like autonomy and anonymity of the online is replicated in the way that police are mobilized for major actions around the state, in that you are more likely to be aggressive and abusive and willing to hurt people if you don't feel like you're going to see them tomorrow, right? In the sense that if there's a small community in BC where there's a small police force and they have to remove an indigenous occupation off their lands, they're going to be much more friendly about it. And that's why the RCMP is going to bring in people from like Toronto to do it, right? But that anonymity is something that I think we need to be very aware of online in terms of the aggressiveness and like the kind of violence that it invokes in people. And the last thing, I absolutely think it is okay to punch a Nazi, and I encourage more people to do it. And this is why I want to say this. And I'm not saying that as a flippant comment, but I think there's actually a really important a thing here, is that violence is as much psychological as physical. And we need to recognize this. Jallianwala Bagh, which was this massacre of like people outside of Amritsar, outside of the Golden Temple, where the British Army just basically closed off a square, women, children, people that were gathered, and they just opened fired and started massacring people in the square, right? And that wasn't just about the British wanting to kill women and children. That's not like, that doesn't have like a great deal of like material gain for them, but it has a massive psychological impact on communities that are oppressed, right? And it's meant to oppress communities to the point to be that you should be afraid to act, you should be afraid to resist, you should be afraid to fight back. Fanon, like obviously like for folks that read Fanon and folks are familiar, like there's a lot of like talk about this, right? And also like we need to understand that these kinds of narratives get taken out of history by colonial powers purposefully, right? Like, I mean, I don't know if people know about, like, we're in Chinatown right now, right? Mm-hmm. People know the history of the Chinatown riots. Mm-hmm. They're written about. What people don't know about is the Chinatown resistance. Mm-hmm. The fact that the Chinese community got guns, had bottles and Molotovs on the roofs of the buildings in this area to fight back. Because that builds up the morale and the ability and the confidence of the oppressed to fight back. And in that sense, the violence that the far right want to inflict, I mean, if you look at Russia, they walk around and brutally beat and try to kill most of the time, and they have, any folks of color in that area, right? There was a man that was lit on fire on Commercial Drive by right-wing, neo-Nazis, these are purposeful acts to intimidate, right? So the punching a Nazi is the fight back that builds up people's characters, and I'm gonna go to that line that I used in my last talk as well, just because I feel it's important, is that a great band, Asian Dub Foundation, if anyone wants to listen to them, they're amazing, talked about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, and Udham Singh, who was revolutionary that went to Europe, and he assassinated General Dyer, who was responsible for that massacre, right? And I know, same reactions happened last time. And then there's a song written about this where they say, "An eye for an eye won't bring back the dead, but it will lift the spirits of my people," right? And I think that is important. Punching Nazis lifts the spirits of people. BAM, which is a by any means necessary, folks of color that are involved in that organization are going out and showing that we can fight back. My father, who lived in South Vancouver, had bottles thrown at their houses by drunk white folks during the 1970s every Friday night. Once in a while, they got up and they fought back because they needed to, because it's a necessity for their psychological needs to resist, right? And I think that's important for us to remember. So, punch a Nazi if you feel up to it. Not everyone has to do it, but if you're up for it, it's all good. Thanks.
I'm voting for Hardjap in 2019.
Won't stand.
I'm also
sorry.
nominating right now.
Yeah, exactly.
I think rather than leap in with a comment, I think maybe, and considering the time of the evening too, we'll open up right away and see if there are any immediate responses or comments. Yeah, Andrew. I see you.
Despite the recommendation that we forget about the past, but everything you're saying sounds so much like the 1930s, even to the Punch-a-Nazi conclusion. Although that didn't work out so well because there were more of them.
Yeah.
But the big issue, strategic issue, that was posed by the kind of situations that we're describing now and that existed in even worse forms in the 30s, has to do with whether the left's main mission is to protect bourgeois democracy and civil liberties or not, to push for something more radical. The historical judgment that most people make is that the defense of democracy is the essential task when it is challenged. And if that puts you in alliance with people who, maybe are not as bad as the worst ones, but are pretty bad, or people with very limited vision and so on, so be it. That's what you have to do. And I'm wondering if, and this then relates to the question of free speech on campus. It's true that idiots like Milo get invited who have no qualifications to speak on a campus. And it's very encouraging for our spirits to prevent them from speaking. But is it wise, given the larger context in which there are far more advocates of that position than of the Punch-a-Nazi position? So I want to ask you, as the people on the panel, what you think about this strategic question.
I mean, just to be clear, right? It's not. I think like having a critique of free speech with an analysis of power does not mean that you don't believe in it conceptually in some ways, right? Like in the sense that, like, of course you want the ability of open dialogue and debate and all of those things, right? I think the first thing is that, and I know other folks like could speak to this as well, is that hate speech needs to be recognized as something different than speech, like in terms of free speech. Like I think that needs to be clear. And then the second thing is that we need to be able to recognize again the power dynamic and what do we do in that moment. So it's not to say that we start saying that we should eliminate free speech on campus. I don't think that's a goal that anyone's going to say. But when, for example, I've been to at least 3 to 4 demonstrations against an Israeli ambassador or an Israeli politician speaking on a campus. Why do I go? And why do we try to shut down and shout down on those events? Because we know a Palestinian representative of that movement is never been and never will be invited. So what is our, and this is the thing, and I mean, Mel Basil, I don't know if folks know Mel Basil. Mel Basil's, he's up at Una Stoughton Camp, and he talks about this concept of responsibilities versus rights. And I think it's a very powerful concept in the sense that he says that rights are something that we're given in the colonial context where property is already taken from us. So the state takes property from people and then it gives you some rights. Someone takes private property and then gives you some rights to work on it, to do whatever, right? Responsibilities are a completely different framing of how we approach these political struggles. So in the context of an Israeli ambassador speaking at UBC, for example, I can look at it as, well, whose right is it to speak from a rights framework? Or I could say, what's my responsibility in this moment, understanding the complete context of both freedom of speech, but also the power dynamic that's at play, right? No. And so, no, but like, I mean, does that not, like, so if I understand that me as an individual have a responsibility to stand up for someone that doesn't have a voice and will never have a voice in that institution, what is my role? To allow the powerful to keep having a voice?
And if I could just add on top of that, because I totally agree with you, Jeff. Add on top of that, and in terms of the numbers game, well, looking at what's happened in recent history with Milo and other speakers like him, I think the numbers have actually been on the punch Nazi side. That is, a lot of people showed up and they've shut down that event successfully for the most part. So I don't know where the numbers fall really, but on the campuses, I'm a little encouraged by where the numbers are falling. And in terms of a common comment, you'll hear that, well, what about when they come for the left or the marginalized? And my response to that is that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because I go, well, they are coming for the marginalized and the left. They have always been coming. They've never stopped coming.
Or the marginalized and the left have never been there to begin with.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
So I don't know what we'd be protecting by allowing the Milo to say what he's got to say. Fuck him, is what I think. But sure.
So, thank you all for your terrific contributions. First, a question for Ajay, and then a question for Harshit. Arjun, maybe just picking up on discussions we've had already in the past. I understand the pessimism that detected in your talk. It was quite a brilliant analysis, I think, of the emergence of the BJP, the discontinuity amidst the continuity. And it was very well put. And starting out with the university as a one space where there could be a kind of a red-blue coalition, a possibility of the left working with the Ambedkarites and the Dalits. So I can understand the somewhat minor tones and minor notes that you were playing there, but at the same time, I mean, September 2016, you have between 150 and 180 million workers out on strike. And yet you're pessimistic. You have governments, popular front governments in Kerala in the south and West Bengal in the north. Is that not something that can be built upon? I mean, obviously we see things from the outside is very different from seeing things from within. But for me, that is an interesting constellation that gives one some hope that there could be an opposition, a meaningful opposition to the Gujarat model now that's, in a sense, India-wide and not just located in Gujarat. So that's my question to you, and Harshit, simple question. When you're punching a Nazi, how do you know that the Nazi is in fact a Nazi? In punching the supposed Nazi, do you not in fact make a Nazi? And this is an important strategic question.
Yeah.
How do we know? I think that there's a kind of aesthetics of danger now, right? And I think Nagel draws this out beautifully, right? There's posturing, there's all kinds of positioning, right? Transgression.
I'm sorry, it's actually Third Reich artillery and aerial
If I could just
bombardment.
So there are all these posturings that are going on. Right? People, a 16-year-old kid in the street who presents as a Nazi, is he really a Nazi? And by punching him, as opposed to having a conversation, or ridiculing, or doing something else other than punching, you not create a Nazi. And this is a very important strategic question.
Absolutely.
Because we're faced with a real situation now. And I'd like to bring feminism on board too. Isn't this then just a kind of performance of a sort of toxic masculinity in its own, in its own way? Listen, I was myself formed by the defensive positions taken up by the Indian community, the Punjabi community largely in Southall. When the NF wanted to march through, they said, no fucking way, we are not letting you march through here. That was self-defense. But this kind of bravado seems to be the other of kind of victim culture, right? No, safe spaces, you know, and so on, right? We want to create these sort of spaces where we're not challenged, but yet we compensate by punching Nazis out in the street. I think there's something here that's not quite right. So
yeah, for sure.
Ajay,
You're right. I mean, we have had earlier also the national industrial action by the centralized trade unions in the country, and we had in a long time now a congregation of 180 small and big farmers organizations who held another big protest in Delhi. See, the issue is that for last 2.5, 3 years, these Gau Raksha Dal, the cow protection groups, have been killing people randomly across North India and also now in South and East. If the centralized working class is so organized and politically so aware, why is it that across the country there's not a single incident of resistance that the left or the organized working class could put up to these small-time junkies? Who is stopping them? See, the fact is that my own understanding is that left has critiqued a lot about economicism, and in the present circumstances when the people are not even able to retain their levels of survival, it's very important to fight for survival. That's its first fight. But essentially, that's all where it ends. And this is the problem with the entire spectrum of resistance in the country, that our oppressed nationality, when it fights about its own right and survival, it doesn't move an inch beyond that. A working class organizes itself and fights for its own rights and survival. It doesn't talk about anybody else.
Trade union conscience.
No one. In fact, the two examples where women who married on their own will outside their religion, and in both cases, Haida's case is going on right now. CPM is the government in Kerala. She's not even providing any kind of social political protection to that girl who has decided on her own that she converted to Islam and she married a man who is a Muslim. She's 25-year-old. She has all the right in constitution to do what she wants. The case goes from a province in south to Supreme Court of the country, and the Supreme Court doesn't give a clear-cut judgment on that. What is going on? It's a state ruled by CPM. So I think the issue is that what we see as color, what we see as muscle and strength, discounting the obvious meaning associated with it, doesn't exist with the left. It doesn't exist. So it's if one can't kind of really bank on them and these forces to kind of deliver. There is a serious issue here, a very serious issue. See, the same CPM government in Nandigram in Singur in West Bengal was killing people who were protesting that they want to give their lands to corporations. So the left in India, largely by and large, is social democrat. First of all, they are using the nomenclature of left. They are not communists. They are social democrats, like any other social democrat across the world. And second is their own forces, and their own sort of organizing capacities are not beyond the minimum economic issues. That's it.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. Like, I feel like aside from Nandigram, even the 80s and like the movements that existed then, I think the same tension emerged, right? Even with like these like internationality struggles, like there's never been small pockets of it, but there hasn't been that broader solidarity movement. All of the cases of like sexual assault that have been like so public, and like it's very piecemeal, the solidarity that's offered, right? Like it's not very strong. And I would argue that's the same issue here, frankly, right? Like, I mean, the union movement in when Gordon Campbell got to power in BC was like softly had embedded itself within social movements, like working with folks in the downtown east side, working with like migrant organizations, working on environmental issues, and all of that over about a 10-15 year span kind of dissipated. And I think like it echoes what's been happening there. In terms of like kind of like the presentation and like who is a Nazi, how do you know they are and who they're not? I mean, like Richard Spencer, I don't know that we need any certification of him. Like, he's certifying himself like publicly, so that's not an issue. People actually wearing Nazi paraphernalia, like not just like dressing as such, but like wearing swastikas and other things, that's another thing. organized groups that have blood and honor, for example, in BC, organized groups that have ideology. And that actually, you know, like actually to be frank, like a lot of the people that are actually engaging in some of these actions come across these folks on a regular basis. So it's not like you're just meeting a stranger on the street and you're like punching them. It's that like you're at a punk show and you come across these folks, you might debate them, you might argue with them, you have mutual friends, and you're combating them afterwards, right? Because like, I don't think the idea is that they don't pose a threat. They, like, I mean, again, I'm gonna keep highlighting, like, a man was lit on fire by these guys. They have the confidence to go.
That for a second.
Yeah, no, but I'm just saying, like, I mean, if they have the confidence to go do that, the state isn't gonna intervene, because clearly Harper has made it clear that he's never gonna place these guys on a terrorist list, right?
We have a different government.
And how do you no? And so I feel like that's the issue. Like that's one of the things that we have to recognize, that it's not random, that people are actually doing it in that way. And the other thing is that I recognize that I hear you, like a lot of it can be bravado, like in terms of men doing this kind of stuff. But you know, Yvette, who's a part of BAM, like she's a young woman of color that wants to go fight Nazis. Right? I've been a part of frontline struggles where elders from the downtown east side have tried to bunch cops. Right? I've been a part of organizations where it's largely women of color, that have occupied and resisted and fought with police officers. Right? Like it's like I get it. Like I'm a man. I'm very critical of my own actions. I actually don't engage in any of this stuff. Right? I don't engage in any of it. But I'm not going to also invisibilize the people that do, to simply say that it is one very clear identity of people that engage in this kind of stuff.
But let's be clear, toxic masculinity isn't just about.
Oh yeah, I agree.
No one's saying go randomly
I'm not
punch,
saying that it is.
No one's saying go randomly punch someone you might think might be a Nazi.
That's not.
Maybe I'm being a bad poet. It's a metaphor, but still.
Yeah.
Sinam, did Hilda, you have something to say?
Yeah.
Good.
Yes.
Yeah.
A few quick comments. Actually, I was going to start with exactly what you asked. How do we know we're punching a Nazi? And when I'm saying this, I think the violence that you're bringing in and the counterfight that you're bringing in is a little bit too totalistic for me, because fighting with police is something else, defending a place is something else, rather than, and punching a Nazi is something completely different. When we are punching a Nazi, just because how do we know we're punching a Nazi? We are, again, within the same waters as liberal humanism. And this, in a little way, it goes back to the question that you asked, Stephen. How do we know a Nazi when we see him, her on in a supermarket? How do we really know him? And when these stories are kind of like being circulated on papers like New York Times, then it makes me feel like, yes, this is what liberal humanism wants, because it wants us to relate to a Nazi on a human level. And if we're relating to a human level, I remember Zizek telling something like, probably Hitler was a very good father, or like a wonderful person to the people around him. So are we going to just say that, yes, he's a wonderful human being? So that is a trap of humanism, and that's a trap of, and I think punching a Nazi is it's Janusz face. We are in the same waters. We are individualizing a whole ideology or a whole practice to a person, and we're trying to actually pinpoint that person. Do you see what I'm saying?
I hear what you're. Let's just take more comments, because I don't want to like keep responding.
Exactly. So Hilda had something next, and we're going back there.
I'm kind of. I feel a little bit annoyed. I want to punch. No.
Totally fine.
No. You know, I was thinking a little bit on what you were saying about the ethical act according to the locality and the circumstances. If you go here and punch whoever you think is a fascist, it might be an act of pure enjoyment, right? Like the one that I want to enact right now. But it is very different if it is someone, for example, in Mexico that is being by the corporation of Canada, contaminating the water. It's very different, the context in which you gather your energy to fight. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
that it's important to get back to the ethical act regarding the circumstances in which you are prompt to act, rather than kind of throwing a line that this is the pragmatics to go. I just want to say that.
And I think Jacob, go ahead.
Just the first point, about Zizek, he's an asshole. Second point, just to reaffirm that about the threat of blood and honor. Earlier this year, they went to an anti-Nazi demonstration in Westminster, specifically to monitor leftists, people that would be at this event. So they're actively engaging in the community and monitoring people.
Surveilling,
So just want to put that
identifying.
out.
Yeah. Adam?
Yeah, I just have a comment, not a question. You mentioned Singh and the assassination of, I can't remember the name.
General Dyer.
The person is almost 20 years after the fact. And I think if we frame this question rather than the specifics of should one punch a Nazi or not, if we frame it in this kind of Nietzschean way of like the relationship of revenge to catharsis. I think that right now, because of the disorientation of the moment, we have a desire for revenge. We have a desire that relates to catharsis. And the question that kind of remains on the table is, how do we act on that in a way that builds power?
Mm-hmm.
And I think some people question about whether that act of punching a Nazi builds power or not. That's a question. But I do think that there is a desire for this thing.
Yeah. Maybe can I just quickly respond to a few things, just so that we just because I want to actually address the stuff that folks have said and not just kind of wash over it. One, I just want to kind of reemphasize that I think because of the caricature of some of the folks that engage in these actions, a lot of people assume that people are going and doing it randomly, right? It's actually not happening randomly. Mm-hmm. People know, when you're saying how do you know someone's a Nazi, people have had conversations with these folks. They've seen what they've been posting online. They know that they're some of these people are actually the people that did light the person on fire, for example, right? Some of them are people like Richard Spencer, which is very clear, right? So it's not as if people are oh, I'm gonna just go to Abbotsford and assume I'm gonna fight a white guy that's dressed in a certain way, and I'm gonna assume he's a Nazi, I'm gonna punch him. That's not what people are doing, right? Mm-hmm. And I also hear you, I think in the global South that there has been generally, there's an understanding that people aren't just doing things for romantic bravado or making themselves feel good. But I would also argue that, I think we're doing a real disservice to, movements like the ARA, and I'd really encourage folks to, actually research and look into, what are some of the work that they've done. But these are the folks that worked with immigrant communities historically and fought, the rise of these kinds of movements historically in places like BC and London, Ontario, and other places, and they've done it calculatedly, right? They will go punch a Nazi if it is required, but that's not all they're doing, right? These are, and I would also say that, there is a fear. There's a guy that has been doing some of this work whose place got firebombed in Abbotsford. Right? When you're going and confronting these folks, it's not just bravado. I've been in conversations with people that are doing this work today in this city that are fearful because they don't have the numbers. They're fearful for their own safety, right? So I just want to emphasize that. I think because of the caricature of what we often want to kind of anoint as these 25-year-old young punk white dudes, and they just want to go get in a fight. That's not what this movement is. And I think again, homogenizing the whole idea of identity, where we just see one person. There might be one guy like that, but that doesn't mean they're all like that, right? Like there is a responsibility that people are taking, and I think that like a lot of this comes out of a sense of responsibility and creating safety in the community.
And clearly there's been a couple videos that have gone viral that are sort of these random, oh my God, someone walked up and punched this guy because he had a swastika on his arm. And, you know, that's not what I think Harjap's talking about at all. And then those are very relatively isolated incidents. Harjap's talking about capacity building and movements for communities to defend themselves.
And fighting back. Like, I mean, I would really encourage folks to read some of the writing of By Any Means Necessary. They're based in Oakland, in Oakland, and I think in the Bay Area. They put it out there. Like, why is it that like a bunch of folks are saying that like we need to get these folks off the streets, right? And I think that's important for us to recognize why those folks are saying that. Let's not just like there is the sensational stuff, right? But there's also like the meaningful stuff where people have actually thought this through, have their own safety concerns, and still decided to go about this.
Go ahead.
And again, apologies, Samir.
No, please.
Well, so technically, if they're actual Nazis, Third Reich, you shouldn't punch them. Again, aerial bombardment, artillery, infantry. But you're kind of technically advocating breaking the criminal code, like Section 236, common assault and battery. Like you need to have a baseline law and order. And I've believe me, I've met these people, perhaps more than you. You need to maintain a baseline. Otherwise, you know, he said, she said. You can build cases against anyone in the mind, on social media. That sounds very messy to me, frankly.
We've already heard about the law being used against itself, and the law always very selectively applies to certain people and defends certain people. So I don't know if that's the first consideration in every, but everything's be very contextual. But I don't know if that's going to be the first consideration every time when you talk about defending people.
I think another good point to make about the whole ethics of punching a Nazi is like, before you even get there, I think it's important to tackle the ideological part of it, and also the ideological part from within. Like, if you're theoretically talking about killing a Nazi, shouldn't we be also focusing on killing the Nazi within ourselves, especially like as settlers on the land here? Just like the culture that we grow up in, you know, it could be as simple as the language that we use, like derogatory terms, stuff like that. Relearning and stop using that kind of language, stuff like that would be important as well.
Well said. I was worried it was getting really too Judish and too macho, and that was actually really. But other comments coming from other directions, other genders? You said mixing the bowl. Seeing as not, we'll go here then here. Go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, you can see clearly that there are problems with playing identity politics, right? And you pretty much say that Nazism is playing a white identity politics. Problem with identity politics, you say, applies to all groups who play it, is that you can ascribe to the center of this identity as victim, and you wake up and go to sleep and everything. And so you can identify problems that may not even exist. And then, okay, again, regarding like punching Nazis and why people think maybe you gotta reword it, is again, like there's the huge criticism that I'm aware of, and I'm not sure how many people here of the left, in terms of if you disagree with them, they'll accuse you on a dime of being a Nazi without having any intellectual discussion. They just don't like whatever it is that you're saying, and then they'll attack. Like maybe not physically, but you're saying physically, right? And again, like Milo came up. I mean, he is flippant and I don't think entirely sincere, but there's no proof that he is a fascist. Like people are flipping out over things, creating problems that may not and usually don't even exist, and ideologically are possessed to follow through in a way that leads, like, it's rooted in resentment and envy, all of these identity politics. Those are negative things. Anger is impotence. So if you act with violence, anger, without engaging any kind of discussion, that's a failure.
Let's have a couple other comments. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just kind of going back to Samir was saying, how do you know? And you guys brought some very obvious examples, but there are less obvious examples. When I was visiting an artist studio, I won't mention his name, although you would have known of him because he's quite well known. But he had like swastikas, banners of swastikas, and strange text, but it was all relating kind of to his artistic. He's a painter, he's you know, he was into the whole neo-Nazi skinhead thing. Like, but anyways, I was at a studio, and I mean, right away you would just go screaming bright lights, neon lights saying Nazi, but I know the artist, he's not extremely Nazi-like, but he has interests. Obviously, I don't know whether it's an aesthetic thing only.
Erotic, I was going to say. Yeah.
But, right, so those are the grayer areas where you kind of go, how Nazi is he? Or, you know what I mean? So those are examples where I would go, who's not Nazi, because I don't really know how far.
And again, Harjav's saying largely it's about communities over time that get to know who they're dealing with. It's not about randomness.
But on the other hand, I would
Is there, okay, I see people pointing at someone else. Go ahead. I'm not sure where they're pointing.
Oh my God, a woman!
Everybody shut up. Maybe not about punching too.
No, exactly. I was more interested in the conversation of really what this to me brings to mind is what do we want power to look like? Because you know, we're talking about shifting power from the hands of one person to another, but we're not doing anything about, or we're not changing the framework of power. We're just shifting the hands of who holds it.
Yeah.
So I'm more interested in that conversation. And another thing that I also want to add, and it's been hinted at by all three of you, where it's a long conversation, but where does the responsibility / fault of the left lie in the shift that you mentioned in the beginning, of the right becoming like the grassroots, taking up that position that the left used to. So where's the left failed in that regard, or has it been too successful that it's?
Yeah, great.
I think in context of India, it's the failure of left to be not there in the grassroots, which has been completely taken over by the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. I think the two basic factors for this is that the entire Marxist leadership came from Brahminical castes. It was a Brahminical Marxism, and B, that the failure of Marx as an extension of that social position is the failure of for the Marxists to both deal with religion as well as caste hierarchy. And failure to deal with religion is, we can see it even unfolding today, that when a citizen or UK citizen is picked up by the police at the airport who's a Sikh, and he's being tortured, and they are not giving any answers of why he's been picked up. There are matters being raised in the Parliament of Britain. And the Sikh community in Punjab and the world over is raising this issue of why this man has been picked up, because there's a history of grotesque torture and brutalization of people illegally. The protest that we are seeing all over the world, do we see the voice of left in that protest? Why not? So, I think, Samir said why I'm being pessimistic, but I think it's already too late for the left. Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to say that. The power piece, I think, is, I mean, that's why I raised the nationalism conversation, is because I do feel like, I feel like that conversation is long overdue on the left. And I'm not coming at it from this notion that I imagine that the nation state's going to be gone tomorrow. But we need to still, like, there's the imagination and then there's the engagement, right? And I think our imagination hasn't even gone to the point of imagining outside of what the nation state looks like. It's like, it's been reified more than capitalism has. And I think we need to do that in our examination of what power looks like, right? Because I would like to imagine it outside of colonial state structures, right? Particularly actually because of like these issues, right? Like, I mean, I think in South Asia, like, there isn't that mutual interest in the sense of like fighting this like class-based struggle against the elites, when you also feel more solidarity only with, like, say, a Sikh community or a Tamil community, because you as a community are collectively oppressed by the state. Right? And the left in India never grappled with that issue, right? Like, I mean, I've had long conversations with folks about this, and it hasn't been like a really prominent discussion in those areas, because in a sense the left in India would say, well, those are not our projects, because they're going to remove state power rather than consolidating it under working class mobilizing. And I think the kind of dismissal of those struggles by the left, and then similarly for these national movements to dismiss leftist politics within their ranks, not recognizing that like the elites and the bourgeois of their communities are maybe leading their national quote-unquote liberation struggles. I think that discussion has like eliminated the ability to actually imagine outside of the Indian state, which is flawed at its core, right? Like, I mean, it was created by the British. It's occupied, like, I mean, you know, Palestine, Israel, like all of these, Canada, right? Like, they're all colonial constructions. None of them follow linguistic lines. None of them follow like cultural, like actual nationhood lines. None of them follow those lines, right? Punjab, like I'm Punjabi, right? Half of Punjab's in Pakistan, the others in India, and that in India it's divided between Hindus and Sikhs. Like it's ridiculous, right? Anyway, so I feel like that's an important aspect of just like the left has to have that discussion, and it can't wait anymore. Like we're seeing Trump, we're seeing. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if nationalism is highly mobilized in the next Canadian election from the right? And if we don't have a solid critique of it, we're not going to be able to challenge it as the left. Same thing with neoliberalism. We didn't even challenge neoliberalism as the left, so that's like, you know, let's check that box first and then maybe move. But like, both of them have to be done together.
So we're actually going to wrap up, and I'm just going to say a real quick word, and I want to say something about the failure of the left, since Harjap, you're mostly talking about power, which is, and the nation, which is very important. And then Samir wants to say something too, and then we'll be more casual here and more casual conversation. But in terms of the failure of the left, I mean, I think about this all the time, and I probably will until the day I drop dead. But I think, you know, two things I would say. One is, and so these are very vague and broad, and you know. One is we need to talk as much as about the, in terms not so much as the failure of the left as a defeat of the left, in part. And what I mean by that, I don't think it's a total defeat. It's not so much left failed. It's boy did capital really fucking go at it. And the most recent version of that is 40 years of neoliberalism in some ways. And then go back to a term that Ajay used, you know, regimes of dispossession, which is always what capitalism and colonialism has been. But it's re-upping and re-engaging with these. And that's what neoliberalism is ultimately, is a re-engaging with these processes, you know, new wave of primitive accumulation, these sorts of things. So the left has been fought tooth and nail, I think, by power, by nation states, by capital. So, you know, yeah, there's failure, but there's as much, you know, holy smokes. And the other side of that is, and I'm not going to say this to be an asshole, but I'm going to put it out there in the air right now too. And keeping in mind, no one's recommending punching a random stranger, but maybe a bit of the temperature in this room is a sense of, on the left, are we too careful sometimes? Do we worry too much about what the law is? Do we worry too much about being too inclusive, even of the people that maybe themselves don't want to be inclusive, but we're tempted to include them? Maybe we need more of the fight back. And maybe something that's happened in the liberalization of the left has taken some of that away. We've lost some of that fire and that fight.
Isn't the contemporary critique of the left, though, it's become intolerant because of these sort of dialogues? It's not overly...
Who says that?
Who's contemporary?
And which contemporary left are we talking about, right? I mean, certainly that exists, but that is not a way to characterize the left writ large, I don't think.
And also, which left? Which left?
I'd just like to say a couple of things here, and that is that, again, with Angela Davis, I'd like to reinforce the sense of internationalism. If we take that position, then we have to decenter some of the analyses, for example, coming from Ta-Nehisi Coates, who understands the rise of neo-fascism in the United States in terms of this mystical, naturalized, fateful whiteness. And I think we, on the left, see more and more of these attempts to sort of lash out at this imaginary, yet all too real whiteness. And I think this is part of the problem that I was trying to get at in terms of how do we know that we're punching a Nazi when we punch a Nazi. There is a certain sense in which if our analysis is that fascism, neo-fascism in the United States is about whiteness, what do we lose in terms of creating alliances? And I guess I was formed in that period in the late 70s where there was a moment very similar to ours now. I mean, I don't see this as being like the 30s. I see it as being like the crisis of the mid-1970s. And what happened there was in Britain there was a tremendous rise of neo-fascism. National Front was about to win some important seats in the election in 79. Thatcher came along and solved that problem because she incorporated a lot of the far right's agenda. What was the response? The response was rock against racism, two-tone, ska, black and white unite. That was it, and this is important for just two reasons. I'm just going to shut up. One reason was this was at the level of popular culture. This was at the level of excitement and creativity and music and culture. And it involved black and white and brown. Today, not so much. I have to say, identity politics is about call-out culture. It's about white people doing this, white people doing that. There is a structure of white supremacy that has to be critiqued. But at the level of calling out white people as such, strategically, this can never be good. And I think this is a way of creating Nazis. This is debatable, but this is my position. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is really, again, strategic alliances. This is what's necessary. Building a popular front. Do I see this as possible on the left today? Unfortunately, I don't. And maybe somebody in the audience, Harjat, maybe you, Steve, you can convince me otherwise, but I really am very pessimistic because of the way the terms of discourse have been established. That, in my view, has got to shift. That's got to change. There are other things that are intended upon that, limiting speech, policing spaces, and so on, which I might, myself, I have a tendency to exaggeration, and so maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. I don't know. But I think this underlying problem, the critiques of people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, I think are on the mark. We need to move the discourse. So, does anybody else want to have the final say, Steve? Because I don't want to end on that note. But,
or someone else in the audience?
Yeah, someone else. Yes, please. Go ahead.
What this whole the call out of the individual whiteness has its stronghold in the emergence of whiteness studies within critical race theory, this is going to be a huge project to try and unpack that. How are we going to go in on critical race theory when we're talking about things like anti-racism? But that is what needs to happen. What you said was so profound to me about the project of building the alliance to just as a starting point, difficult, very difficult. But I'm very anxious about. At some point, Harjit, you had tried to separate a kind of liberal identity politics from a cleaner, maybe more organizing around identities. But as a person who has found myself in rooms that are organizing around identities, particularly women of color groups, there is a great deal of fracturing happening, particularly in one way, which is this word invalidation is coming up. And maybe we can fight about this later, but
can you just explain that?
This thing of, I know I'm a person of color, or maybe I don't identify, whatever, your way of identifying through language with your personhood. But I need you to tell me that I am a person of color. I need you to also tell me that I'm a woman, or that this is the gender that I am identifying. I need it from you, otherwise you will be invalidating me, and we can't sit here and we can't move forward in whatever organizing we're doing otherwise. And that is
submitting to the master.
I mean, it's an anxiety I think that is meaningful to think about, just in the way language is being taken up around race. Otherwise, we'll stay in this place of the alliance. What is the alliance?
Should we leave it at that?
I think
that should be another event.
I'd like to thank everybody who's come to the
Okay.